Hello, everybody. I like to start introducing today's speaker. We are very fortunate that Geri Richmond made time to come and visit us. It took her longer to come here than it would from Bangkok or the country that she's been doing a lot of
Oregon's a long way away.
So we're very glad that she's here. So I can tell you a little bit about Geri. She got her PhD in the University of California, Berkeley, and she is the presidential chair in science and professor of chemistry at the University of Oregon, and she does physical chemistry. Her research uses laser spectroscopy and computational methods that focus on understanding environmentally and technologically important processes that occur at water, semiconductor, and mineral services. Her teaching and outreach activities focus on science literacy and policy and the development and implementation of career building and mentoring programs for globally engaged scientists. Geri has a lot of awards, and I can spend hours just telling you about them, so I'll just briefly say that Geri is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and is a fellow of the American Chemical Society, the American Physical Society, and the Association for the Advancement of Science, or the AAAS. She has served in many leadership roles on many international, national, and state governing and advisory boards, including as a current member of the National Science Board and recent president of the AAAS. In fact, I met Geri way back when she was the chair of the Basic Energy Science Advisory Committee, and I was a member, so that goes back to, I don't know, 20 years or something. So she is the founder and director of COACH, which is a grassroots organization that has been assisting in the career advancement of scientists around the globe. She first started doing it nationally, and she took it internationally. And this since 1997. Awards for her research accomplishments and scientific accomplishments include the National Medal of Science from President Obama, which is really cool. The ACS, I saw the picture with President Obama, and the picture with her and her family and President Obama. Award for her scientific, also the ACS Joel Hildebrand Award, the APS Davidson Gerber Prize, and the Christie Medal of the ACS. Award for these education outreach and science capacity building efforts include the Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Mathematics, and Engineering Mentoring, the ACS Award for Encouraging Women in the Chemical Sciences, and the ACS Charles L. Carson Award. So we're going to hear today the importance of diversity and inclusive leadership in research and innovation. So help me welcome Geri.
Thank you, Nora. It's a pleasure to be here. Nora has invited me for many years and it never quite fit into the schedule. So it's a treat to be here, and especially when she's here as head of the Department of Physics, which is really special also. I'm here today in my capacity to talk about the importance of, as my title says, strong and inclusive leadership in research and innovation. And this is something that I and I'm sure a number of you in this audience feel very strongly about. And so I want to share with you my thoughts about this in working not only in the US, but also in many countries around the world with a large focus on developing countries where they're a little bit further behind than we are, but they still have the same kind of challenges that we have in many areas. And I'm hoping that I can include this in time for you to ask questions and interact with you rather than me just be the talky person. So when I talk about leadership, and particularly leadership in research and innovation, I mean leadership broadly. I don't just mean head of a department, I actually mean leadership in the broadest terms. And so there's opportunities for leadership every day, and even those of you that I see that are here as students or graduate students, there's even leadership roles for you to play, and the earlier you take on those leadership roles, the earlier you know something about leadership. And so whether you're leading a seminar or a classroom, or even giving a talk at a professional meeting, you should think of yourself as a leader. And also, if you're in kind of a leadership appointment in any capacity, whether it be appointed as head of a board or a committee, not just at your institution, but outside of here, as well as head of a department or research institute. And also, even if you're speaking in a department meeting, which we all love and live for, department meetings in which you need to take a leadership role on in some kind of capacity as a committee member or leading some type of effort. So again, I think of leadership very broadly, and I think everyone in this room has the ability to take on leadership posts and has taken them on in their careers. So where do we as scientists and engineers learn these skills in order how to be a leadership? Well, mostly by example, and not necessarily good examples. Because the lady that's in the bottom of the slide there, my sons tell me that that's me talking to United Airlines. Whenever they screw up my plane reservations once again. But it is mostly by example that we learn our leadership, unless we've been able to have some type of leadership training. And in fact, as many of us know that did our first lecture to a large classroom before we even had any type of teaching training. We know what that feels like to be mostly by example. And oftentimes that example isn't always the greatest. But when we started doing coach workshops, I'll talk a little bit later about coach. When we started developing workshops for women scientists across the U.S. on leadership skills and negotiation and communication that we have now run for 20 years, in the very early days when we would say that we were going to run these workshops or talk to people about coming to these workshops, we oftentimes would get a response, often more from the male side of the room, that you mean my scientific prowess isn't enough to enable me to be a leader. I mean, shouldn't leadership really be based on how strong you are as a scientist and not necessarily on other skills? And we felt very strongly, as I'm sure everyone in this room does, that just being a fantastic scientist does not necessarily make you the best leader or necessarily the best teacher. Because innovation and high-impact research take a lot of different qualities, especially to make it work well in a way that is most productive. And so in that case, as it says here, it requires good innovation, requires good leadership and good sponsorship. Used to be that you could survive by being the lone wolf that does your own science in your little cubby hole, but it just doesn't work so well anymore unless you're someone that might do theoretical work or even in mathematics where you stay in your little cubby and maybe work on it. But even today, as we're going much more towards team efforts, we need to be able to work with many others and oftentimes lead, especially leading our graduate students and so forth. So it relies on effective teamwork and our ability to form teams and communicate with those teams. And we certainly know that from teaching that good communication is good. What I'm going to focus on in the next few minutes, though, is the last two, and that is that it really does thrive on diversity in all dimensions. Research shows that. And it flourishes best when it's in a supportive environment, where everyone is working in a supportive environment. So I want to talk about, and inclusive, so I want to talk about these last two for a few minutes. So what do we mean by thrives in diversity in all dimensions? Well, one dimension is social diversity, and that is that we know from research that having social diversity in a group, whether that be social, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, and age, is proven to have the best outcome in research and innovation. It is proven, okay? It is proven. And so, because that does enhance creativity, results in better decision-making and problem-solving. And there have been many studies that have demonstrated this. An example I can think of at the University of Chicago, where they did where a classroom was giving out kind of a mystery to be solved. And so they gave this mystery to be solved and they did a series of these experiments. They gave the mystery to be solved to a very homogeneous group, and then they gave the same mystery to a group that's mixed race, gender, and so forth. And it proved over and over again that the best solution, the most creative solution, came from that mixed group, not the homogeneous group. And there's a wonderful Scientific American article that describes some of these studies. And in fact, it was published about 7 or 8 years ago, and then with the new administration that just came in, they republished it. So the downside of this social diversity issue is that it can cause a lot of discomfort because you're working with people that you may not be so comfortable with, because they may not be in your social area or area of expertise. So you can have rougher interactions. Trust takes a little bit longer to build if you're not comfortable with that group, whether they be a different color or a different gender. But there's a huge upside, and the research shows that when we work in groups that are very different from us, that we actually work harder to come up with a better solution. We work harder in order to build that trust. And that extra effort that we put in order to make it work actually increases our ability to be creative because we're working harder at it. If we're all in a homogeneous group, then we all kind of think the same way, and so coming up with a solution, we all kind of move forward in the same way, and you may not come up with such a creative solution. And so this diversity is really important. And it also, as I'll talk about a little bit later with regards to mentoring, we also need to think about that when we're talking about mentoring relationships. Because oftentimes women want to be mentored by women, men want to be mentored by men. But in actual fact, we might have a better mentoring experience if we're working with someone we might be a little uncomfortable with. And so this is, again, pointing out the fact that we need to get a little bit out of our comfort zone in order to be more creative. So it also thrives on information diversity. And so with information diversity, this means that we embrace a lot of different ideas that come forward. And in fact, we encourage a lot of different ideas to come forward. So we can have a full spectrum of ideas to go forward with this. But in order for information diversity to really work, then everybody has to feel like what they say is important. And so that's where the inclusive comes in, and that we need to be able to listen to all the voices. And so in order to have good, strong innovation, people have to feel comfortable in expressing their views and even disagreeing with one another. And so you can all agree that the more supportive environment you have, the more likely people will bring up new ideas and will feel like if they bring up ideas, somebody will say it's really stupid. So all stages of problem solving benefit from this inclusive, supportive environment and diversity of ideas and experiences, all the way down from identifying a problem, looking for possible solutions, coming to a decision, as well as implementation. All of these benefit from having an inclusive environment that embraces social and informational diversity. But we do have examples of failures out there where we didn't have an inclusive environment in different areas of innovation. And the most ones that are most commonly known are, for example, with airbags. The early airbags in cars were largely developed by men for the men's bodies, killed off women and small children, right? Because they were made for much larger bodies. So had we had, in those beginning stages, a more diverse group designing these airbags, we might have had a better product in that case. Another is early heart valves, largely developed by men, for men, too large for women. And voice recognition systems, early voice recognition systems were calibrated to male voices and leaving women's voices largely unheard. And in fact, it's American voices, because in many different countries that have different accents or stronger accents, and including many African American voices, are not able to be recognized even today as well as voice recognition systems. So I had one guy, when I explained this to him, he said, so this is why my wife's driving is so bad. It's supposed to be a joke. It's like a English driver. It has nothing to do with the voice recognition system. And the last one is more pertinent today, and that's web algorithm biases, where just by the way the algorithms are written, by what shows up on your computer screen when you're doing your searches, is women users get served more ads for lower paying jobs, and men get served more ads for higher paying jobs. So developing these algorithms also have some biases in them that are produced by the people that put them together if you don't have a full diverse group designing them. So inclusive leadership is ensuring that we have diversity in all of these dimensions and that it is practiced. So let's talk a little bit about now leadership, and then we'll go talk about inclusivity. So we all know that leadership has evolved over the years, and so just as an example, when we were in post-World War II, those of us that are old enough to remember something about that time, the leader was really, as the expert, and it was really more of a military model that worked. And so the leader had competencies of planning, controlling, and organizing, and really was much more of a military model, where the team, you could call it a team, the people that were being supervised by that person, followed that person. And there wasn't that much dialogue about how the leadership might be different or how the product might be different. The leader really led. And then we evolved into the 60s and 70s and had a little bit looser view of leadership and what works as a leader. And that became more as the leader involved the other people involved in the project. And so there was more of a dialogue between the leader and the team that person was leading. And the leader in this case was really creating a vision, setting direction, and then also empowering. So much closer to the model that we find very effective today. And then beyond that, and over into now, into our 2017, 2016, 2015, leader as a learner. So now the managing uncertainty is much higher as a priority, finding resources, leveraging learning. But this distance between the leader and the team, as you see, has gotten smaller and smaller. There's less hierarchy, much more level organizational charts than we've had before, much narrower in terms of these long hierarchical charts. And so today, the most effective leaders are actually ones which are interacting with the team. They're still leading, but they're still interacting with the team in this more inclusive environment. So it's really evolved to the case at which this inclusive leadership is actually working better today, and it's evolved over the years to that point. And so by embracing it and feeling comfortable with it, we're actually on the forefront of leadership. So if you look into the research and you think yourself about what do you think are the predictors of success for a leader, what do you think a few of these are? What do you think the traits of a good leader are? Give me some examples. You can just shoot them out. I'm going to put these in terms of numbers of what it shows first, so let's see what you got.
Good communication.
Good communication, excellent. What else?
Judicious choice of the team.
Judicious choice of the team.
Willingness to listen.
Willingness of
Listen.
listen. Really important. Open mind. Good. What else? I haven't heard from this side of the room yet. What's it about this side? What do you think? What's a good leader? Victor came in to be stared at. What's a good leader? Take constructive criticism from the team. Good.
Big ideas.
Big ideas?
Yeah.
Big ideas?
You can see the future in the big.
Visionary?
Visionary. Yeah.
Visionary? What else?
Knowledgeable.
Knowledgeable. Good.
Ethical.
Ethical. Yeah. Isn't that another one?
Being comfortable with people who are more competent than they are.
Being comfortable with people more competent than they are. Always hire better than yourself, right? Yes.
Making people on the team feel that they're valuable contributors.
Absolutely. Being inclusive and making people feel like they're really important. Yep. What else? I haven't gotten number one yet.
Willingness to make decisions.
Making
Willingness to make decisions.
willingness to make decisions rather than just waffling. Yes. What else? What? Empathy. Good one.
Taking responsibilities.
Taking responsibility. These are all great.
Charisma.
Being prepared to say you're wrong.
Being ready to say you're wrong and adjust. Still missing number one. Inspiring.
Confidence.
Confident. Okay, I'll give you a clue. Starts with T.
Trustful.
Trust. Trust. And why is that number one? Well, you all know once you lose the trust, you lose the team, right? So trust is number one. Trust is number one. And it takes time. You don't walk into a room or into a new position and you're trusted immediately. So walking the walk and talking the talk is important, but trust is number one. Number two, then, we've heard about the rest of these: productivity, competency, ability to set reasonable agendas, self-awareness of personal strengths and weaknesses. A lot of these you've mentioned. And integrity in the treatment of others and ability to learn from experience. Reasons why leaders fail in the workplace? What do you think the first one is? Loss of trust, of course, right? Betrayed trust. And then decline in productivity, insensitive, abrasive, and intimidating style. Now, this is a style that we sometimes see used, but it's not really effective. Maybe the leader feels good about being intimidating, but nobody else in the room does. Cold, aloof, and arrogant, over-managing, overly ambitious, and unable to be strategic. So that's the list profile in this leadership. So, what about inclusive leadership? What about inclusive leadership? Here I have the first one: equality in treatment and opportunity. And we kind of discussed these as I went through the other leadership too. But inclusive really means treatment of everyone in a very positive manner. And also really appreciating people's uniqueness and what uniqueness they bring to the room. Heard that brought up too. And high team performance through individuals having the confidence to speak up. I have to say that in my many years of doing research, I have to admit that some of the best ideas have actually come when my graduate students have disagreed with me and convinced me they should do a different experiment. And fortunately, I left it. Because really, some of our best discoveries have come when I said, let's go in this direction, and they convinced me that actually a little bit different direction to try out might be better. And thank God I listened to them, or was too busy to change their minds, or whatever it was. But they had to convince me. But they had to disagree with me in order to do that. And that's why it's really important that we respect the disagreements, that if they're done in a professional manner, of people that work with us. Because it's really important. We all have we like to think of ourselves as a very broad view, but those we work with can even make it broader. So this inclusive leadership means really being willing to listen to everybody. In traits of inclusive leadership, commitment and courage, and that commitment and courage comes from your courage to be able to disagree when, for example, if you believe that your inclusive leadership is really important and diversity is really important in your team, some others may disagree with you. So the courage to say, this is the team I'm going to build, and this is how I'm going to move forward. Sometimes that takes courage. Also, the cognizance of bias and blind spots. I'll talk a little bit about bias as we go a little bit further, because we all have biases. Being humble, listen, and is responsive. And also culturally aware and empower without being controlled. These are important traits of inclusive leadership. They are also important traits, as I'll point out, in mentorship also. So creating this inclusive environment where all views can be expressed is really important. And I know we have a number of students in the group, and I encourage and empower you to get confidence in speaking up, as well as younger faculty too, and for all of us to embrace those ideas. Because for some, disagreement is viewed or is perceived to be bad practice. And I particularly see this in a number of different countries that I've been working in, that it's just forbidden to disagree. But in actual fact, disagreement is what we want, right? Disagreement is what we want, as long as it's done in a professional manner. Being able to banter ideas back and forth is fabulous. That's the way we come up with the best solutions. So it should be valued as long as it's done in a professional manner, and it's an important component of innovation. That's how you come up with the most innovative processes, when you banter back and forth on your different ideas. Push yourself out of your comfort zone. Now I'm going to shift a little bit because I want to talk now about the fact that this diversity doesn't necessarily, is challenging and has been challenging for all of us. And that is certainly true for women in science and technology, because as we know by looking at the demographics of the faculty here at UConn as well as at the University of Oregon, we certainly have a smaller number of women in faculty positions, but you can also look at some of the graduate programs also. And so if this is actually just looking at the percentage of women in S&P 500 companies, in terms of the labor force is 45% women, whereas the CEOs at the top are 4.6%. So I think 2012, 2013 numbers. But they certainly show that as we are trying so hard to increase the number of women in the ranks of graduate students, I think chemistry is now up to 50% BS degrees, whereas Amy, something like that, but then it gets to 30% graduate student, and it goes on down. In physics is something like 15 undergraduates, 12 graduate students, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Not so bad, not so bad. But the numbers are small. In engineering, the numbers are very small too, depending on which area of engineering you are. So there are many good reasons for having women leading research and innovation, and I would say that this is not just women, but also diverse groups, but these are my statistics for women. Fortune 500 companies with at least 3 female directors show higher capital investment, and you can read that, the numbers go up. Okay, so the more diverse the team, again, the more success based on the benchmarks that are used in those areas. In 2012, IT patents out of the US produced by mixed gender groups were cited 30 to 40% more. You can see these are the 1,500 US S&P firms where innovation is key to success. Female representation in top management was key, as well as companies with more diverse teams also have a lower turnover rate and also more successful inclusive performance. So the numbers are there showing us that the innovation that we need, that increasing the number of women in underrepresented groups pays off big time. The question is, how do we do that? If we don't have inclusive environments, it's not worth it. So research does show that it's more difficult for women than men to be leaders. And women face barriers at all levels. And this is all levels when you're in an area where the majority is men and the minority is women. It's tougher for women to be selected for leadership roles, and women are more evaluated more harshly in leadership roles. I can remember, I have many examples of where I will be on some type of an advisory board, and they'll be talking about nominations of someone else to be on the board, or that they can think of to be nominating, and you'll hear, and the committee would be, maybe 75% male, 25% women. And you'll hear Bob, Joe, and John, Ralph, and then somebody says Mary, and then it's like this trap door opened in everybody's brain, and then there's Sarah and Sally, and all the female names come out. But there's this little barrier oftentimes to people recognizing that actually women could play this role also. And so, and also with regards to being women evaluated more harshly in leadership roles, we know from teaching evaluations that women get harsher teaching evaluations than men in STEM fields. We know that. And it's because of the fact that those students in the audience are socialized or conditioned to expect the professor to act a certain way. And if that way that they act is not what their social norms are, then the women get evaluated more harshly. So we really struggle in higher education with how you figure out, first of all, how you can possibly change things so that it wouldn't happen, but also how you take this into consideration for promotion and tenure issues. Now, I could go on with this one. I think I'll stop there and see if you have any questions later. But nevertheless,
I have a question.
yeah.
Because and I don't want to forget it.
Yeah,
But it actually has to relate to what you're talking about with trust. And I know that a lot of women in the audience may disagree with me, but I have found sometimes that there is a bias among women against women in these roles. And sometimes it's like, not just simply that there's, so how does one address that?
Oh, I'm not saying it's all the guys that are doing this. There are women in this classroom too. So the women are biased against the professor as much as the men are biased against the professor when you have that happening. So I'm not saying that this just is the guys that are nailing the female faculty member. The women are too. It's the biases. And I'll come back to this in a minute. I have an interesting example that when there's, you know, for women, there's a much narrower band of behavior that's acceptable to a large group than men. It's much larger. And so for women get nailed when they are too disciplined and not enough nurturing, showing enough nurturing. So it's this expectation that women will be both nurturing and a disciplinarian. But the nurturing has to be there. If it's too much disciplinarian, they're the bitch. If they're, you know, it's too nurturing, they're really soft. Whereas men have a broader range of ways that they can teach to both the nurturing and the disciplinarian, but they can get away with being much stronger of a disciplinarian without worrying about whether they have to be nurturing. So you have to find this kind of sweet spot, and I learned this through my own teaching. I had to find many years of teaching huge 400 student classrooms in introductory chemistry. When I came in as the authoritarian in the classroom because I was short and young, and I felt I really needed to kind of do some table pounding, in order to get people to listen to me. Then I got teaching evaluations that were, she's a bitch. But when I was then come in and showed that I really cared, which I did, in addition to being a disciplinarian, it totally flipped. And so in our coach workshop, when we started bringing in people to teach us about leadership for women, that's exactly what they talked about, this narrow thing. Now, I was also telling Robin that I started my career at a women's college, teaching at a women's college. I was at Bryn Mawr College for 5 years when I first got started, where I had almost all women in the classroom. And I was the only female faculty member at Bryn Mawr College at that time. So all the other faculty were older men. Okay, and so I had difficulty in the classroom because the women in the room were not comfortable with me leading them because they were used to having older men lead them. And so I saw the other side of it where the women were biased against me because they were used to seeing the men. So that's a lot to say to answer to address your point, which is that both men and women have these biases. We all bring them to the classroom. Okay. No, and I welcome anything you bring forward. Other questions? Okay, so women in academia, here are a few statistics. In India, only 3% of vice chancellor positions are held by women. In the US, only about 15% of National Academy of Science are elected members. Terrible shape. Canada, women earn less than men. In Europe, hold only 18% of full professorships in Europe. So, it's prevalent everywhere that women are not reaching leadership positions, and we need to have them. So what are the factors? What are the factors that are leading to this? The fact that women are not getting to these upper levels as much as we would like to see them move up and as fast. They call it the glass ceiling. As a chemist, I call it the polycarbonate ceiling because instead of breaking through, you just kind of bounce off it. So there's a lot of factors, and many of you in this room, especially in leadership roles, worry and think about this. And what we hear in the coach workshops, and we know from research, heavier service teaching loads, family obligations, cultural expectations, microaggressions, implicit bias, and inadequate mentoring. I mean, the line can be even longer, and even though some of these may not affect some women, and some may be minor, they all add up with time. And so what happens then with time is that this woman actually ends up having a much heavier load as she's climbing up that ladder, as she has these additional burdens of responsibility, and may just come off the ladder either by choice or by inability to get tenure because it's so slow. And this, of course, is well documented in Virginia Valiant's work, which is now 20 years old. And I want to focus on these last two, because I just want to bring these up as 2 points for us to think about. And I know this campus is working on the issues of implicit bias, but maybe some of those in the audience have not heard so much about it. So I'm just going to spend a few words on this, because it goes back to your point, sir, about the biases are not just, we all have the biases. So implicit bias is these non-conscious biases that we all have. And if you want to test to see if you have them, you can go to the Harvard website on implicit bias, and you can do online tests to show that you have these biases, whether it be gender or race or cultural biases that you bring. And this actually influences us a lot, especially if it's we're not conscious of it. And that's why it's oftentimes called non-conscious bias. And this can happen in evaluations of work and performance of professionals. And they generally are not something you talk about, but most people are unaware when they are happening. And they are held by all of us, regardless of our race and gender. And the result is that men and majority groups consistently then become overrated. So one way that we try to overcome these biases, but the biases happen worse when we're doing things very fast. So for example, when we are doing, when we get a whole file of applications that we're looking at for job position, and you got a stack of 100 of them, and you're trying to go through every one of them, well, if you do it too fast and don't give yourself time to think hard about each person, then your biases kick in. So you're less likely to have these biases if you give yourself time to think and study the data in front of you rather than automatically pushing them off. I must admit, last week, I haven't told you about this story, I'll share it with you though, that I was at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. They were having a wonderful event for women in, starting a Women in Science Symposium. And I walked into a room, and there was the director of LBNL. It was a nice luncheon that we were holding. There was a director of LBNL, and then he had Professor Dowda, who's a CRISPR woman working on CRISPR there, and then another woman that was there. And so Michael, and then there was a gentleman that was there, African-American gentleman. And so Michael introduced me to the first woman and the second woman, but he didn't introduce me to the African-American gentleman. And so rather than me going up and introducing myself, I had this, didn't even think about it, I had this bias in my mind that he wasn't important. Me, I've been working on this for years. Turned out to be the new provost of the chancellor system at the UC system, right? And then I just overcompensated. Before he was introduced, I looked at him over there and thought, oh my God, I forgot to introduce myself to him. So then I overcompensated and spent the rest of the lunch with him. But it was wonderful. It was wonderful to talk to him because we had a lot to share. But even I thought I was starting to clean up my biases. There they were right in front of me also. So we all have to be really careful and not let these biases get in our way. So, and we have many examples of a number of different studies, musicians, where choice of musicians for a symphony, they were finding that they're having very few women chosen in the tryouts, but in actual fact, when they put everyone each behind a curtain and did the tryout, that actually, so they couldn't tell whether it was a male or female, they ended up with many more women that were chosen because of, again, the biases. So we need to work against it. And now on, and the other issue of mentorship, particularly for women and underrepresented groups, mentorship can be a big issue. And so women face this, and I want to put underrepresented minorities in there too, face additional challenges in finding mentors, limited access to potential mentors through informal or formal settings, perception that women need women mentors. I sort of alluded to that earlier, that actually we need to mix it up. And peer perceptions of cross-gender. So if you're a male and wanting to mentor a female, if you're fearful that someone will think of there's something else you have in mind other than the mentorship, then you might be afraid to go into that mentoring relationship. But we all can be very important in mentoring, and we need to think broadly about who we can mentor, especially underrepresented groups of women, because many times they're not in the network that passes information. They're not in the network or the power network that passes information on to each other about jobs or whatever. So let me spend a few minutes about mentorship, because I know from Nora that there is discussion on campus about mentorship. And I've also been working with the different DOE national laboratories on this issue, and especially to help them get mentors for underrepresented groups in the laboratory. And a lot of times what I hear with mentorship, or the fear that I hear from the scientists, particularly the male scientists, is that they're just uncertain of what mentorship is. What does it look like? What do you expect? And so what I try to do is present some kind of structure around that, and ways us to think about, if you haven't mentored someone before, how you might easily move into that role. Or if you're afraid to ask someone to mentor you, how can you find somebody to mentor you? So a mentorship is a relationship with a more experienced, knowledgeable person, helps guide the less experienced, and one person professionally assists the other. I think you all have some sense of what mentorship is. And traits of effective mentors, you're going to see these words again: commitment and courage, cognizance of bias and blind spots, humble, listens and responsive, the same things as a good leader. Culturally aware, empowers individuals. But there's an additional one. And the additional one for mentorship is confidentiality. Really important. Confidentiality is one of the most important elements, that when you're mentoring someone, you don't tell someone else about what you've discussed. And as scientists, bring us a problem and we want to solve it, right? This is not what mentorship is. Mentorship is getting the person you're mentoring to figure out how to solve the problem. It's not solving it for them. It's having an interaction with them and listening and guiding them. It is not solving a problem for them. That's really important, because if you're always solving their problems, they're always going to be dependent on you to solve their problems. You are not to intervene and say, oh, you're telling me you're having difficulty with this particular person. Let me go talk to him. I can iron it out. It's not what mentorship is about at all. So mentorship works best when both the mentee and the mentor experience benefits, and it's not involved in mentor solving the mentee's problems. So I look at mentorship actually as 3 different categories, and under this big mentorship umbrella. And that is coach, sponsor, or advocate, and the other is mentor. So let me just briefly talk about these 3, because I think it's important to do that. Now, so coaching, this is very task-oriented, can be short-term. You're still being a mentor, but it's very task-oriented. Maybe helping someone with a grant proposal, maybe helping somebody apply for a job, maybe helping somebody practice interviewing skills. But this is what coaching is. It's short-term, it's very action-oriented. And we all need that at some point. We all need that at some point. So finding someone that can help coach you can be very important. Oops. Sponsorship or advocate is someone who really goes out and sells you. They're your marketing agent. So they're the one you say, gee, I would really like to be able to meet people in this particular network, or hire people that I'd like to get to know that might review my grant proposals or whatever. They're the ones that go out and say, you know, she's the best thing around, or he's the best thing around. Be great for your position that you've been just advertised. They're the advocates, and in this case, they largely drive the relationship. They're the ones that are out there. You give them some hints of what you'd like to have them help you with, and you go out and help them as much as you can. And this advocate, this sponsorship, then the longer term one is really the mentor. And that's where it's a longer term relationship. It may be over a series of time, maybe over just a year, and maybe over several years, but you really get to know the person well. You listen to them, you help guide them in the direction that they're going, but it really is long term. Really is long term. And in this case, the mentee drives the relationship. Now, I think the reason I think it's important to bring up these 3 is because some people may be uncomfortable being a mentor. When in actual fact, you might get started, with being the advocate first. And if the relationship works well, it might get a little bit further. So recently, when I was doing a workshop in Australia, and actually this was a scientific meeting, and we had a woman there who was a Nobel laureate from Australia, so they had her come back, and so we had a little after-dinner panel discussion, and she got up and talked about, as a woman scientist, what had really helped in her career. And she said, in the area of biology, and she said, well, what's been really important to me is to be able to have a good mentor in my career. So as the discussion went on, someone said, well, what is mentorship? And so I then defined it in these 3 different terms. And we were on stage, and she turned to me and she said, oh, I never had a mentor. I had an advocate or a sponsor, and I had someone who coached me, but no one that was a long-term mentor. And still very successful in how she had gotten to where she was with the other 2 without the long-term one. So we should not undervalue any of these in a mentoring relationship. But what a mentor is not a therapist. So, wants to know all the details of how your mother raised you in order for you to end up being like this or whatever. It is not a therapist. So those that might be afraid that they're going to start digging into some stuff they don't want to know about, it's got to, this is really upper level. So not a therapist. So going back to this issue of how does low number of women in STEM fields impact innovation, and again, I think we can even broaden that to the underrepresented groups. Well, it really means fewer women to counter these cultural biases that they're trying to provide an example of successful women that can help with innovation. And also, I think it also makes this career trajectory a little fuzzier. So when we think about, when you all think about, and I think, the guys in the room, when you were thinking about what careers you were going to go into, or those of you that are graduate students, what careers you're going to go into, you might be able to imagine a male as a role model of somewhere you might go, whether it be in government labs or industry or wherever or academia. But when, as an underrepresented minority or a woman, when you don't see anybody that has that's a successful role model, then that's just really foggy. You can't envision what your career path is going to look like. It's just harder. And so we just really need to have those role models just to be able to connect to see what's beyond it. I mean, I grew up as a child, I grew up on a farm, and Robin and I shared our experiences. I grew up on a farm, and I had no idea growing up what an engineer did. I thought an engineer drove a train, in front of the train. That was an engineer. And so I had, neither of my parents were scientists, they were farmers, and my mother was a beautician, and I just had no concept. And so then when I went through undergraduate school, I never had a female faculty member in the sciences. And in graduate school at Berkeley, they finally did hire one woman when I was, Judith Clinton, when I was there, kind of my last year there. So I never had this kind of role model. So when I left graduate school, I was going to go into industry. So I interviewed with all these companies because my sister went into industry, and that was the only one I knew. And so I interviewed with all these companies, and some really weird stuff happened during those interviews, and I ended up on the faculty of Bryn Mawr College. I mean, I remember interviewing at 3M, and they said, the women took me aside and they said, 3M stands for 3 men. So, and so just weird stuff happened. So, I really had this, I always had this trajectory in mind of going straight to academia, didn't I? Now I ended at Bryn Mawr because I figured for a few years I'd hang out at Bryn Mawr, and they didn't have any other women tenured faculty, so, this should be pretty easy, right? But then I fell in love with research, and then it was all over. And a fuzzy view. So how does a low number of women, again, fewer women at the top level setting priorities for science, including innovation, are particularly relevant, and again, diversities of opinion is important. So with that, with regards to women getting in leadership posts, that was why in 1997, along with Jean Pemberton, we started the organization called Coach, because we were really concerned about the fact that as women were reaching their mid-careers in their 40s, we were finding out that they were not getting the distinguished lectureship invitations, they were not getting the job offers, they were not getting nominated for awards, they were not in the chemistry field. And so we thought, well, let's get together and figure out what we might be able to do about this. So Dreyfus Foundation gave us some money for the 12 of us, to Janet Osteryoung being one, Cynthia Friend, Harvard, Angie Stacy, a number of different women at Berkeley, got together and gave us money to get together for 4 meetings in which we could talk about how women could get leadership roles in chemistry and what was really going on. And this is 1998, 1997. And we all, first of all, most women had never been in a group of 10 other women in the room or 11 other women in the room at one time to discuss these issues. And everybody said, oh, well, it's fine, let's see what we can do for everybody else. And then because everybody was really busy, I thought, well, in order for them to come to another meeting, everybody had kids and blah, blah, blah. And in order, research groups, and in order for them to come to this meeting again, I should bring somebody in that's really interesting that can speak to us. And so we then brought in Jane and Barb, who are still with us, our coach facilitators, and they gave us a workshop on negotiation and a workshop in leadership in one day. And at that time then, to a single person, everyone admitted the difficulties that they were having. Angie Stacy was having her lab space taken away for no good reason. There were promotions being denied for the women faculty, highly successful. And everybody came out and admitted that this was really hard at the point in our careers where we realized that we should be starting to be successful. And those women, Jane and Barb, taught us negotiation skills and leadership skills to get us out of this stuff. And so when we came back 6 months later, all of our lives had changed, completely turned around. And so with that, then we said, well, we need to take these workshops outside of just our group and developed a series of other workshops on leadership and negotiation and communication, which we continue to run and have run now for 20 years at universities all over the country. Over 20,000 women have attended our workshops and a lot of increasing number of men. You guys are not left out either. And then about 5 years ago, we've been taking the workshops internationally, and these are the different countries now that we've worked in. In Africa, the many different countries I've worked in Africa, the workshops are for both men and women because the men are as disadvantaged as the women are. But by bringing in a team of women to run the workshops, we show women as leaders, as potential role models. So that's going to wrap up what I have to say today. Thank you very much for listening. And the whole point is inclusive leadership is critical for success in science, research, and innovation. And it takes work. It takes practice and team effort, but when done right, the benefits are measurable. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have.
Questions from the audience? Yes, Philip.
I even have a comment on geography. My daughter's an English instructor. She told me that if the class sits like this, facing the teacher, it's not as effective as if they sit around the table like in the boardroom, because then they get involved with each other.
Yes. Yes, that's absolutely true. We just can't quite configure our classrooms.
So just already the configuration
Of the room.
has an effect.
That's absolutely true. And I certainly see this because a lot of our workshops, sometimes we'll end up in an auditorium, which is ridiculous because we do a lot of role playing and so forth. And so people have to do strange things in chairs in order to get it to work. But absolutely, the geometry, the lighting in the room, the acoustics in the room make a difference too. It's very true.
So we talk a lot about what women can do what men can do to improve the trajectory of women's careers in STEM. But could you say a few words about is that more important, as important, or less important than reaching young girls at grade school and high school and getting them further along in the STEM pipeline?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question because I think that they're all equally important. We've chosen to focus more on the sort of career building towards the upper level just because that's, where we are. But I also strongly believe that if we encourage underrepresented groups to come into the system, and the system is broken, then the retention rate is as we see it now, which is a retention rate that is much, much lower for women and minorities in the sciences once they get to here. And so we put in this concerted effort to get them in, and then we lose them. So, so it's equally important to increase the pipeline, but then what are they presented with once they get here? So
Do you think we're doing a good enough job getting them in the pipeline?
No.
And we're just not retaining them?
no, but I think there are a lot of I think there are a lot of social factors. I think there are a lot of social factors that many of which we cannot control. A lot of factors, many of which we can control. And so I was doing this plot. I'm going to do this plot with you with regards to retention. So there's data that shows that the retention rate for kids at 16 that want to go into science, and if they stay in science up till they're 22, 16, 17, both genders. We're not going to talk about breaking them up yet. Okay, and all genders, okay? And then you do it, and so retention rate on this axis, and this is the economic status of the country, okay? So, and so this is, the lowest economic rate, so this is Myanmar, Madagascar, and up here we have US, Japan. So the retention rate is way up here for those that are in countries that are being developed, where to get out of poverty, there's a big push in order to go into STEM fields, and then it goes like this. So the retention rate in developed countries, highly developed countries, is really abysmally low, right? And so what we have to, and to change that number to be significant, there's a lot of factors that went into this, right? And so to change that number to be significant, we have to work at all levels, men and women, right? Because it's that retention. If we could just double the retention, we would move way up in that 16 to, and you can say, well, it's even earlier than age 16, for heaven's sakes, it's adolescence. But on the other hand, it's really that retention once they're interested. Because the interest is there if we can just keep them in the system, initially, if we could just keep them in the system. And we could have a long discussion of whether the way that we teach science is an appropriate way to retain students. I mean, we can talk a lot about that, and I understand physics is trying new ways of which, or thinking about trying new ways in which you have more of a studio, and chemistry too, and a lot of the sciences having more of a studio interaction where you're really trying to keep people retained in that case. It's very interesting that if you look at Engineers Without Borders, you look at the demographics of the graduate students that are working in Engineers Without Borders, and it's 50% women, okay? That is not most engineering departments, maybe getting closer to bioengineering. But, tying into the fact that wanting to have some type of a social impact with the science that you learn can make a difference rather than just wanting to hide out in your lab and fuss. Although I think that's all my graduate students do, so don't let them know that. But still feeling like you have a social impact can make a difference too. And I think we just don't get across that much. That what you're doing in your laboratory actually can have an impact.
Yes?
What can I do as an undergraduate student to help break down these barriers other than know that they exist?
So I think as a graduate student being aware of this, an undergraduate student being aware of this, and really reaching out to, what's your major?
Structural biology and biophysics.
Yeah, so reaching out to others, being inclusive when you have study groups or any dialogue that you have to welcoming others, and really making one of the community scientists as an undergraduate. I oftentimes see little fiefdoms of the guys studying here and the women studying here, and even doing that and being aware of your biases is really important too. And also being aware that networking, we know from network theory that most men tend to network with each other. Women are actually better at networking, maybe because of their social skills, but they tend to also be more just women and the men. And so we need to get those networks to mix more, because a lot of times the power is in the male network, although maybe some of you guys don't feel it has much power to be in those networks, but there generally is more power in them. And so mixing that up is really important. So thanks for asking that question, because you guys have a role to play in that too. Yeah.
There's a question here, and then
Earlier you had said the traits for the year, and I was just wondering if you were going to I said it's more of yeah, I think you said there was some research, I was just wondering what was the United States, because I said you brought some of that's extremely hierarchical, but also leading in their engineering. Yes. So, good question.
Could you repeat
So
the
if you
question?
didn't hear that, the leadership skills that I presented here is, or the leadership traits I presented here. The traits are important in these different countries, but how much you value, how the leader values them is different. So yes, indeed, there are countries that are much more hierarchical. And so when I give these traits with leadership and the hierarchy, you can believe it opens up a whole discussion. Particularly in India is a good example where you hear more of this hierarchical. Not so much North Africa. Nora and I have worked in North Africa, and the women there are pretty gutsy. But certainly, and I see that more in. I don't see that so much in some countries in the Middle East, but I certainly see that in the communist countries in Southeast Asia, as you might expect. Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. And so you just kind of have to adjust to the different countries, but yes, it's very different in some countries, especially if it's more of a military regime as opposed to much more of a democratic regime, or just completely chaotic government, which is India.
It was, sorry, I'm just trying to keep track of the reason.
So
It's a great question.
I think it's interesting to think about the diameter of the pipe, right? And whether or not the diameter of the pipe should be bigger for STEM in general, right? But we all know, I think, that the diameter, the composition of the pipe right now is 50-50 at the undergraduate level for biology, and I think even for chemistry now, maybe not for physics, right? So the pipe is leaky. So what are we going to do about the fact that as people leave undergraduate and think about going off to graduate degrees, we already lose about, 20% of people, women, decide that they're not going to go off to graduate school. So it's not 50-50 even at first level graduate school, and then it gets worse and worse and worse the further along you go. Do you have ideas about what we can do about?
Yeah, so actually we've been working a lot of this at the National Science Board, and so what we have been having a lot of dialogue around the issue of that this pipeline is not a pipe with little leaks that people fall out of, but actually the pipeline is actually a tree with lots of branches. And I showed that pipe as being 3 different directions, and so, but in today's workforce, it's not 3, it's many branches. And unfortunately in academia, we send the message to our graduate students that if you don't go into academia, you're a failure, or they leave thinking that, when in actual fact there are wonderful different careers out there that are in science policy, that there are a lot of different areas that I think are actually more enticing to many and would retain students more, but unfortunately our academic institutions are not set up with faculty that know what all those experiences are. So getting our undergraduates to see the variety of different career options that they can take, but mostly only if they go into graduate school, because like in many of the areas, whether you're working in the State Department or you're working in a lot of these other agencies, you have to have a PhD in order to be able to really have the kind of skills and leadership that makes a difference versus just Xeroxing and paper pushing. So I think one way to do that is to show that actually there are a lot of careers out there beyond this industry, government lab, or academia. And the statistics are really compelling. We put out a note in NSB just a couple of months ago on this that you can find on the Science and Engineering Indicators website that talks about the percentage of PhD scientists in the workforce that actually stay on the lab bench. It's really small. Now, those of you that want to stay on the lab bench, that's perfectly fine, that's really great, but some people want something more than that, and they want to know their career trajectory can take a lot of different dimensions. So that's only my thoughts with regards to that we present this view that a scientist is this very monolithic kind of a person that only has a few choices, when actually there are a lot of choices.
So my question is, when you're an early career scientist, you have a lot of demands on you, and you have a lot of pressure. Where can you put your time? What should you invest your time and effort, work, and practice into? And so you're kind of that torn between developing softer skills that will help you in your later career and producing amazing science really quickly in order to stand out. How do we balance these as like a scientist who's dealing with pressures, wanting to develop inclusive leadership skills, but often not having a place to say, look, I spent all this time developing inclusive, strong leadership skills, but there isn't a place for that to recognize yet until I'm a later scientist.
Well, there's a time for everything,
Right.
okay? You knew that.
Yes.
But actually what I tell with regards to the kind of workshops that we teach, I feel a real weakness that graduate students have, many faculty too, is in the area of negotiation. And by negotiation, I don't mean just asking for a better salary. I mean how you have conversations on difficult subjects that people disagree with you on. And graduate school is the best place to hone those skills because the stakes aren't there. You know, when you get out and being able to know what it means to negotiate for something, being able to reach a win-win situation where you're able to reach a consensus in a professional manner with the kind of skills that they normally teach in business school is something that will help you in leadership down the road, but it also helps you are you a graduate student?
Yes.
Yeah, also helps you as a graduate student. You guys all know that you can, guys, I'm from Kansas, so girls and guys fall in the same guys category. You all know that you can negotiate for how long it takes you to get your thesis done or how many chapters in your thesis. Sorry, faculty, to tell you that. These are all negotiables, and And so you have to have an honest negotiation, but you do it in a manner that's back and forth and inclusive and constructive, right? And you need to practice those skills in order to be a good leader. Because whether you're the person that they're negotiating with or you're negotiating for something, they're really important skills to have. And I think that oftentimes in the sciences, we're used to the style where you come up and you say, can I have this? And the person says no. Worked for them, didn't it? Worked for them, it didn't work for you. And so developing skills by which you can get the conversation going so that you can understand the no, so you can work towards the next is really important. So developing those skills in graduate school I think is really important and using, because I oftentimes think as scientists, you just don't haven't developed those skills yet. And then always keep in mind these leadership skills.
Well, thank you, all of you, for
Yeah.
this very interactive discussion. Thank you, Geri, for the presentation, and why don't we thank Geri?
Great. Congratulations.